The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty frontier town of Copper Creek as Jake Morrison guided his weathered horse through the main street. His leather boots stirred small clouds of dirt with each step, and his wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his sun-weathered face. Jake had been riding alone through the desert for 3 weeks, carrying mail between remote settlements. But something felt different about this particular afternoon. The town seemed unusually quiet for midday. Most of the shops had their shutters half closed, and the few people on the street moved with nervous glances over their shoulders. Jake noticed the way conversations stopped when he passed, how mothers quickly pulled their children closer. His instincts, sharpened by years of surviving in the unforgiving wilderness, told him trouble was brewing. As he approached the local saloon, the Dusty Horseshoe, angry voices drifted through the swinging doors. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his hand instinctively checking the position of his Colt revolver. The wooden boards creaked under his boots as he stepped onto the covered walkway. Inside the saloon, a heated argument was taking place. Sheriff William Barnes, a heavy-set man with a permanent scowl, was addressing a crowd of about 20 townspeople. His deputy, a younger man named Tommy Collins, stood beside him with a smug expression that made Jake's jaw tighten. "I'm telling you, folks, we caught them red-handed," Sheriff Barnes declared, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. 3 Apache girls sneaking around the Henderson ranch last night. Old man Henderson swears they were trying to steal his cattle. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jake noticed how quickly fear could turn neighbors into an angry mob. He had seen it before in other towns, where suspicion and prejudice poisoned communities like a slow-acting venom. "What proof do you have?" asked Martha Wilson, the school teacher, her voice trembling but determined. "Did anyone actually see them taking anything?" Sheriff Barnes turned toward her with cold eyes. "Henderson's word is good enough for me. These savages have been causing trouble for months. It's time we sent a message that law-abiding citizens won't tolerate their thievery." Jake stepped forward slightly, trying to get a better view of the situation. Through the crowd, he caught a glimpse of 3 young Apache women sitting in the corner, their hands bound with rough rope. They couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years old, and their dark eyes showed more defiance than fear. Something about their dignified silence in the face of accusations struck Jake as authentic innocence. The eldest of the 3 girls, with long black hair braided with small beads, met Jake's gaze for a brief moment. In that instant, he saw intelligence and strength, not the cunning of a thief. His gut feeling, which had saved his life countless times in the desert, told him these young women were not guilty of any crime. "So what's it going to be, Sheriff?" called out Pete Hartman, the blacksmith. "You going to lock them up or what?" Sheriff Barnes straightened his badge with obvious pride. "Justice will be swift in Copper Creek. We're going to have ourselves a proper hanging tomorrow morning. Make an example that'll keep the rest of their kind away from our property." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Jake felt his blood run cold. A hanging without a proper trial was not justice. It was murder disguised as law enforcement. He had witnessed enough real lawlessness in his travels to recognize it when he saw it, regardless of which side of a badge it came from. As the crowd began to disperse, already making plans for the next morning's gruesome spectacle, Jake lingered near the bar. He ordered a whiskey and listened carefully to the conversations around him. The more he heard, the more convinced he became that something was seriously wrong with this situation. Tom Henderson, the rancher who had made the accusation, was known throughout the territory for his hatred of the Apache people. His ranch had been struggling financially for months, and several people mentioned how convenient it was that he had discovered the theft just when he needed an excuse to claim insurance money for missing cattle. Meanwhile, the 3 young women sat in dignified silence, occasionally whispering to each other in their native language. Jake noticed how they comforted the youngest, who appeared to be fighting back tears. Their behavior seemed more consistent with frightened innocence than hardened criminals. As the afternoon wore on, Jake made his decision. He could not stand by and watch 3 innocent people die for a crime they likely did not commit, but he also knew that confronting the sheriff directly would only result in his own arrest or worse. He would need to be clever, patient, and very careful if he wanted to save these women and uncover the truth behind what was really happening in Copper Creek. The sun was beginning to set as Jake finished his drink and walked back to his horse. Tomorrow would bring either justice or tragedy, and he was determined to ensure it was the former. But first he needed to learn more about Tom Henderson and his suspicious cattle theft claim. Something told him that the real story was far more complicated than anyone in town wanted to admit. Jake spent the evening gathering information around town, carefully avoiding direct questions that might raise suspicion. At the general store, he learned that Tom Henderson had been drinking heavily lately and bragging about coming into some money soon. The store owner, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned that Henderson had purchased an unusual amount of rope and supplies the week before. Claiming he was expanding his operation, as darkness fell, Jake rode out toward the Henderson ranch, keeping his horse at a steady but quiet pace. The desert night was cool and filled with the sounds of coyotes in the distance. Stars provided enough light for him to navigate the familiar terrain, following cattle trails and fence lines toward Henderson's property. The ranch sat in a small valley surrounded by rocky hills and sparse vegetation. Jake dismounted about half a mile away and approached on foot, moving carefully between the scattered boulders and desert brush. His years of experience had taught him how to move silently across any terrain, a skill that had saved his life more than once during encounters with both hostile wildlife and dangerous men. From his hiding spot behind a large rock formation, Jake observed the ranch house and surrounding buildings. Oil lamps burned in several windows, and he could see shadows moving inside. After watching for nearly an hour, he noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. Henderson was not alone. At least 3 other men were with him, and they appeared to be celebrating something. Moving closer, Jake managed to get within hearing distance of the main house. Through an open window, he heard Henderson's voice, slurred with alcohol and louder than it should have been for a man whose cattle had supposedly just been stolen. "Those Apache girls played right into our hands," Henderson was saying. "Found them camping by the creek just like you said they would. Easy enough to chase them onto my land and claim they were after my cattle." Another voice, one Jake didn't recognize, responded with a harsh laugh. "Sheriff Barnes is dumber than a box of rocks. Believed every word without asking a single question. By tomorrow morning, those girls will be swinging from the hanging tree and no one will ever know what really happened to your cattle." Jake's jaw clenched as he heard the third voice chime in. "Selling them cattle across the border was the smartest thing we ever done. Made more money in 1 week than this ranch sees in a whole year. And now we got ourselves a perfect cover story." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Henderson had been rustling his own cattle, selling them in Mexico for quick cash, and then blaming the Apache girls for the theft. It was a clever scheme that would have worked perfectly if not for Jake's timely arrival in town. Henderson continued his drunken confession. "Best part is, once word spreads that we hanged some Apache thieves, other ranchers will be too scared to investigate when their cattle go missing. We can expand this operation all across the territory." Jake realized he was listening to more than just a frame-up for cattle theft. This was the beginning of a larger criminal enterprise that would terrorize the entire region. These men were planning to use racial hatred and fear to cover their crimes while innocent people paid with their lives. As he prepared to leave and report what he had heard, Jake noticed a movement in one of the ranch's outbuildings. Curious, he worked his way around to get a better view. Through a crack in the wooden wall, he saw something that made his blood boil with anger. Inside the building were clear signs of recent cattle slaughter and butchering. Fresh hides hung from hooks, and the smell of blood was still strong in the air. This was where Henderson and his accomplices had been processing stolen cattle before selling the meat across the border. The evidence was right there, but Jake knew that by tomorrow morning, it would all be cleaned up and disposed of. More disturbing was what he found in the corner of the building. Personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to Henderson or his men. Among the items was a distinctive silver bracelet that Jake had noticed on the wrist of the eldest Apache girl earlier that day. They had taken it from her when she was arrested, probably as additional evidence of her supposed guilt. Jake carefully collected the bracelet and a few other items that could serve as evidence, then began his careful retreat from the ranch. But as he moved through the darkness, he stepped on a dry branch that snapped with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire valley. "What was that?" one of the men inside the house called out. "Probably just a coyote," Henderson replied. But Jake could hear chairs scraping against the floor as the men stood up. "Better check it out," the unknown voice suggested. "Can't be too careful." Jake heard the front door creak open and saw lamplight spilling out into the yard. He pressed himself against the ground behind a cluster of prickly pear cacti, trying to become invisible in the desert landscape. Heavy footsteps approached his location, and he could smell tobacco and whiskey on the night air. "Don't see nothing," one man called back to the house after several tense minutes of searching. "Must have been an animal," Henderson agreed. "Come on back inside. We got plans to finalize before tomorrow." Jake remained motionless for another 20 minutes before slowly making his way back to where he had left his horse. The ride back to town gave him time to think about what he had learned and what he needed to do next. The evidence he had gathered was compelling, but would it be enough to convince a town that seemed eager for a hanging? As he reached the outskirts of Copper Creek, Jake realized that exposing Henderson's crimes would be only the first step. He also needed to find a way to rescue the 3 Apache women before dawn, because he was certain that Sheriff Barnes was either part of the conspiracy or too corrupt to care about the truth. Either way, those innocent girls would be dead by sunrise unless Jake took matters into his own hands. Jake returned to town in the early morning hours, his mind working through various rescue plans as he tied his horse behind the boarding house where he had rented a room. The jail was a small, sturdy building made of adobe and stone, with iron bars on the windows and only one entrance. Sheriff Barnes lived in a small apartment above the jail, which would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. As the first rays of sunlight began to appear on the horizon, Jake could hear the sounds of the town beginning to stir. People were already talking excitedly about the planned hanging, and he could see men gathering wood and rope near the large oak tree that served as Copper Creek's gallows. The sight made his stomach turn, but it also strengthened his resolve. Jake knew he needed help, but most of the townspeople had already made up their minds about the Apache girl's guilt. However, he remembered Martha Wilson, the schoolteacher who had questioned the sheriff's rush to judgment. If anyone in town might listen to reason, it would be her. He found Martha at the schoolhouse preparing lessons for the day despite the distraction of the planned execution. She was a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. When Jake knocked on the door, she looked up with surprise and concern. "Good morning," Jake said, removing his hat. "Miss Wilson, I need to talk with you about those Apache girls. I believe they're innocent." Martha set down her pencil and studied Jake's face carefully. "What makes you think that, Mr. Morrison?" "Jake Morrison, and I think that because I spent last night watching Tom Henderson celebrate with his partners in crime, they framed those girls to cover up their own cattle rustling operation." Martha's eyes widened, but Jake could see she wasn't entirely surprised. "I had my suspicions," she admitted. "Tom Henderson has always been a liar and a drunk, but Sheriff Barnes seems convinced of their guilt." Jake quickly explained what he had witnessed at the ranch, showing Martha the silver bracelet and other evidence he had collected. As he spoke, he could see her expression change from skepticism to horror to determination. "We have to stop this hanging," Martha said firmly. "But how?" "Sheriff Barnes won't listen to me, and most of the town is already convinced those poor girls are guilty." "I have an idea," Jake replied, "but I'll need your help. Can you gather any other people in town who might question what's happening? We need witnesses when I present this evidence." Martha nodded quickly. "Dr. Samuel Hayes might listen. He's treated Apache patients before and doesn't share the prejudices of some others. And possibly Judge Crawford if we can reach him before the hanging." "Judge Crawford is here?" Jake asked with surprise. "He arrived late last night for territorial court business. He's staying at the hotel, but I don't know if he's aware of what's planned for this morning." Jake felt a surge of hope. A territorial judge would have the authority to stop the hanging and order a proper investigation. "Can you get him to the jail in 1 hour? Tell him there's new evidence in the case." "What about you?" Martha asked. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure those girls are still alive when the judge gets there." Jake left the schoolhouse and made his way toward the jail, noting the growing crowd of spectators gathering around the hanging tree. Sheriff Barnes was nowhere to be seen, but Deputy Collins was standing near the jail entrance looking nervous and uncomfortable. Jake approached Collins with what he hoped appeared to be casual interest. "Big day for justice in Copper Creek," he said, testing the deputy's reaction. Collins shifted uncomfortably and avoided eye contact. "I suppose so," he muttered, "though I wish Sheriff Barnes would have waited for a proper trial." This response told Jake what he needed to know. Deputy Collins was having doubts about the situation but lacked the courage to act on them. Perhaps he could be turned into an ally rather than an obstacle. "Deputy Collins," Jake said quietly, "what if I told you those girls are innocent? What if I had proof that Tom Henderson framed them to cover his own crimes? Collins looked around nervously to make sure no one else could hear their conversation. "What kind of proof?" he whispered. Jake showed him the evidence he had collected, explaining what he had witnessed at Henderson's ranch. Collins examined the silver bracelet and listened with growing concern. "This is serious," Collins said finally, "but Sheriff Barnes will never believe it. He's too proud to admit he made a mistake, especially with half the town watching. That's why we need Judge Crawford to see this evidence," Jake explained. "A territorial judge can overrule the sheriff and order a proper investigation." Collins was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with a difficult decision. Finally, he spoke. "Sheriff Barnes went to get breakfast at the hotel. He won't be back for at least 20 minutes. If you want to talk to those girls and verify your story, now would be the time." Jake felt grateful for the deputy's unexpected cooperation. "Thank you, deputy. You're doing the right thing." Inside the jail, the 3 Apache women sat in a single cell, still maintaining their dignity despite their desperate situation. When Jake approached, the eldest girl looked up with recognition and a glimmer of hope. "You were at the saloon yesterday," she said in English that was accented but clear. "Why are you here?" "Because I know you're innocent," Jake replied. "And because I'm going to prove it." He held up the silver bracelet. "This is yours, isn't it?" The girl's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "My grandmother gave it to me. The sheriff took it and said it was evidence of our guilt." "What were you really doing near Henderson's ranch?" Jake asked. "Looking for our horses," the second girl answered. "They wandered away from our camp during a storm. We tracked them to the creek near his land, but we never went onto his property." The youngest girl spoke up, her voice shaking. "The white men chased us onto his land and then claimed we were stealing cattle. We tried to explain, but no one would listen." Jake felt his anger building as he heard their story. These young women had been guilty of nothing more than trying to recover their own property, and they were about to die for Henderson's greed and the town's prejudice. "Help is coming," he told them. "A territorial judge is here, and we're going to present evidence of your innocence. Just hold on a little longer." As he turned to leave, Jake heard approaching footsteps and Sheriff Barnes's booming voice echoing from outside. Time was running out, and Jake still wasn't sure if Judge Crawford would arrive in time to prevent a terrible injustice. Sheriff Barnes burst through the jail door with his face red from anger and alcohol. He had clearly been drinking again, and his mood had grown darker since yesterday. When he saw Jake standing near the cell, his hand immediately moved to his gun. "What are you doing in here, stranger?" Barnes demanded, his voice loud enough to wake the entire town. "This is official business, and I don't remember giving you permission to visit my prisoners." Deputy Collins stepped forward nervously. "Sheriff, I don't care what you were doing," Barnes interrupted. "Get this man out of here before I arrest him for interfering with justice." Jake raised his hands peacefully but stood his ground. "Sheriff, I have evidence that these women are innocent. Evidence that Tom Henderson has been lying about the cattle theft." Barnes laughed harshly. "Evidence? What kind of evidence could a drifter like you possibly have? You weren't even in town when the crime happened." "I was at Henderson's ranch last night," Jake said calmly. "I heard him confessing to his partners about framing these girls. He's been rustling his own cattle and selling them across the border." "That's impossible," Barnes snarled. "Tom Henderson is a respected member of this community. He wouldn't what?" Jake interrupted. "Lie to cover up his crimes? Sheriff, I have physical evidence and eyewitness testimony." Barnes drew his gun and pointed it directly at Jake's chest. "I've heard enough of your lies. You're either working with these Apache thieves, or you're just some bleeding heart who thinks he can come into my town and tell me how to do my job." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Deputy Collins looked terrified. The Apache girls pressed themselves against the back wall of their cell, and Jake remained perfectly still with his hands raised. Outside, the crowd was growing louder and more impatient for the hanging to begin. Just as the situation seemed ready to explode into violence, the jail door opened again. Martha Wilson entered, followed by a distinguished older man in a black suit and Judge Crawford, wearing the official robes of a territorial judge. "Sheriff Barnes," Judge Crawford said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "I understand there's some question about the evidence in this case." Barnes lowered his gun reluctantly but kept his grip tight. "No questions at all, Judge. We caught these thieves red-handed and justice will be served." "I'm Dr. Hayes," the older man said, stepping forward. "And I've just heard some very disturbing allegations about how this case has been handled." Judge Crawford looked around the jail, taking in the tense atmosphere and the obvious fear on everyone's faces except Jake's. "Mr. Morrison, I believe? Miss Wilson tells me you have evidence that these women are innocent." Jake carefully reached into his jacket and pulled out the silver bracelet and other items he had collected. "Your Honor, last night I witnessed Tom Henderson confessing to framing these women. He's been rustling cattle and selling them across the border, then using the Apache girls as scapegoats to cover his crimes." Barnes stepped forward aggressively. "Judge, this man is lying. He's got no proof of anything." "Then you won't mind if we examine his evidence," Judge Crawford replied coolly. "And you certainly won't object to postponing this execution until we can conduct a proper investigation." "Postpone it?" Barnes's voice rose to almost a shout. "The whole town is expecting justice this morning. These people want to see these thieves hang." "What the people want and what justice requires are not always the same thing," the judge said firmly. "Mr. Morrison, please present your evidence." Jake quickly explained everything he had witnessed at Henderson's ranch, showing the judge the bracelet and describing the conversation he had overheard. Dr. Hayes examined the items carefully and confirmed that they appeared to belong to the Apache women. Judge Crawford listened intently, asking detailed questions about timing, locations, and specific conversations. Martha Wilson added her observations about Henderson's suspicious behavior and financial difficulties, while Deputy Collins reluctantly confirmed that the arrest had been rushed and that no real investigation had been conducted. Outside, the crowd was becoming restless and angry. Voices could be heard demanding to know why the hanging was being delayed. Sheriff Barnes kept glancing toward the door, clearly worried about how he would explain the situation to the mob that was expecting entertainment. "Your Honor," Jake said, "if you'll allow me to take a small group to Henderson's ranch right now, I can show you physical evidence of the cattle rustling operation. The butchering equipment and stolen hides should still be there." Judge Crawford nodded. "That seems reasonable. Dr. Hayes, Deputy Collins, you'll accompany us. Sheriff Barnes, you'll remain here to keep order in town." Barnes's face turned purple with rage. "You can't just come into my jurisdiction and—" "Sheriff," the judge interrupted, "I can and I will. This is a matter of territorial law, and these women will not be executed without a proper trial based on real evidence." As the group prepared to leave for Henderson's ranch, Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They were making progress, but he knew that Henderson and his partners would not give up their profitable criminal enterprise without a fight. The ride to the ranch could be dangerous, especially if Henderson realized that his scheme had been discovered. Martha Wilson remained behind to help keep the crowd calm and to watch over the Apache women. As Jake mounted his horse alongside Judge Crawford and Dr. Hayes, he could see angry faces gathering outside the jail. The mob was not going to be happy about having their entertainment canceled, and Jake worried about what might happen if they decided to take justice into their own hands. The sun was climbing higher in the sky as the small group rode out toward Henderson's ranch, carrying with them the hopes of 3 innocent women and the future of justice in Copper Creek. Jake knew that the next few hours would determine whether truth would prevail over prejudice and greed. The ride to Henderson's ranch took nearly an hour, during which Judge Crawford questioned Jake thoroughly about every detail of what he had witnessed. Dr. Hayes, who had served as the territorial coroner on several occasions, was particularly interested in Jake's description of the butchering operation and the evidence of recent cattle slaughter. As they approached the ranch, Jake noticed something that made him uneasy. Smoke was rising from behind the main house. Either Henderson was cooking an unusually large breakfast, or he was destroying evidence. Jake shared his concern with the judge, who immediately ordered the group to increase their pace. When they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, their worst fears were confirmed. Henderson and 2 other men were frantically loading a wagon with items from the butchering shed, while a large fire burned nearby. Clearly, someone had warned them that their scheme had been discovered. "Halt in the name of territorial law," Judge Crawford called out as they rode down toward the ranch buildings. Henderson looked up with panic in his eyes, then grabbed a rifle from the wagon and fired a warning shot over their heads. "Stay back," he shouted. "You got no business on my property." Jake drew his own weapon but held his fire, waiting for the judge's orders. Dr. Hayes and Deputy Collins took cover behind a water trough, while Judge Crawford continued to advance slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Mr. Henderson," the judge called out, We're here to investigate allegations of cattle rustling and conspiracy to commit murder. Surrender peacefully, and you'll receive a fair trial." Henderson's response was another rifle shot, this one aimed closer to the group. One of his partners, a heavy-set man with a scarred face, also drew a gun and began moving to flank their position. "Judge, get down," Jake shouted as he spurred his horse forward. What followed was a brief but intense gunfight among the ranch buildings. Jake's years of experience in dangerous situations served him well as he used the terrain and structures for cover, while trying to prevent Henderson and his men from escaping. Deputy Collins, despite his earlier nervousness, proved surprisingly capable with his weapon and helped pin down the scarred man behind a broken fence. The fight ended suddenly when Dr. Hayes, moving with surprising agility for his age, managed to get behind Henderson and knock him unconscious with a heavy piece of wood. The other two men surrendered immediately when they realized their leader was down and they were outnumbered. As Judge Crawford secured the prisoners, Jake and Dr. Hayes examined what remained of the evidence. Despite Henderson's attempts to destroy everything, they found plenty of proof of the cattle rustling operation. Fresh cattle hides bearing brands from several different ranches were hidden in a storage room, along with detailed records of sales to buyers across the Mexican border. Even more damning was a journal kept by Henderson that documented the entire criminal enterprise, including plans to expand their operation and use Apache tribes as scapegoats for future thefts. The journal contained specific details about how they had tracked and trapped the three young women, forcing them onto Henderson's property to create the false appearance of cattle theft. "This is more than enough evidence to clear those women and convict these men," Judge Crawford declared as he examined the journal. "Mr. Morrison, your courage and investigation have prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice." Dr. Hayes nodded in agreement, not to mention saving the lives of 3 innocent people and stopping what could have become a widespread criminal conspiracy. As they prepared to return to town with their prisoners and evidence, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice would be served, but he also knew that the fight wasn't entirely over. Sheriff Barnes would need to answer for his willingness to execute people without proper evidence, and the town would need to confront its own prejudices and assumptions. The ride back to Copper Creek was tense, with Henderson and his partners bound and guarded carefully. Henderson had regained consciousness and spent most of the trip alternating between angry threats and attempts to bargain for a lighter sentence. His journal had revealed connections to other criminal activities throughout the territory, making him a valuable witness if he could be convinced to cooperate. As they approached the town, Jake could see that a large crowd was still gathered around the jail and hanging tree. Word of their expedition had apparently spread, and people were anxiously waiting to learn what had been discovered at the ranch. Sheriff Barnes stood on the steps of the jail, his face dark with anger and embarrassment. Jake could see that Martha Wilson and several other townspeople were positioned protectively near the jail entrance, clearly concerned about the mood of the crowd. Judge Crawford rode directly to the center of the gathered people and stood up in his stirrups to address them. "Citizens of Copper Creek," he announced in a voice that carried across the entire square, "justice has been served today, but not in the way many of you expected." A murmur of confusion and disappointment rippled through the crowd as people realized that the planned hanging had been canceled. Some voices called out demanding to know what was happening and why the Apache women were still alive. "The 3 Apache women accused of cattle theft are innocent," Judge Crawford continued. "They have been the victims of a conspiracy led by Tom Henderson to cover his own crimes. Henderson and his partners are the real thieves, and they will face trial for cattle rustling, conspiracy, and attempted murder." The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some people seemed relieved to learn that justice had been properly served, while others appeared angry and disappointed that their entertainment had been canceled. Jake watched carefully, knowing that mob mentality could still turn dangerous even in the face of clear evidence. Sheriff Barnes stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Judge, are you saying that I made an error in this case?" "I'm saying that you failed to conduct a proper investigation before condemning 3 innocent people to death," Judge Crawford replied firmly. "Whether that was due to incompetence or corruption will be determined by a separate inquiry." The implications of the judge's words were clear to everyone present. Sheriff Barnes's career in law enforcement was effectively over, and Deputy Collins would likely be elevated to sheriff pending a proper election. The old system of frontier justice based on prejudice and assumption was being replaced by actual law and order. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many people expressing shame and regret for their eagerness to see the hangings, Jake felt that real progress had been made in Copper Creek. But he also knew that changing hearts and minds would take much longer than exposing one criminal conspiracy. 3 days later, Jake stood outside the Copper Creek jail as the 3 Apache women were officially released with full apologies from the territorial government. Judge Crawford had worked quickly to process all the evidence and formally charge Henderson and his partners with multiple crimes, including cattle rustling, conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder through false testimony. The eldest Apache woman, who Jake had learned was named Ayanna, approached him with the silver bracelet now restored to her wrist. Her 2 companions, sisters named Kaya and Kitlali, stood beside her with expressions of deep gratitude. "You risked your life for strangers," Ayanna said in her careful English. "Our people will remember your courage and kindness." Jake removed his hat respectfully. "I just did what anyone should do when they see injustice happening. I'm sorry it took so long to uncover the truth." "The truth has a way of surviving even when people try to bury it," Kaya replied. "Our grandmother always taught us that good people exist in all nations and all colors." Dr. Hayes approached the group, carrying a medical bag and wearing a satisfied expression. He had spent the past few days treating the women for injuries they had received during their arrest and imprisonment, and had become an advocate for better relationships between the town and the nearby Apache communities. "Ladies," Dr. Hayes said, "I want you to know that not everyone in Copper Creek supported what almost happened here. Many of us are ashamed of how quickly we jumped to conclusions based on fear rather than facts." Judge Crawford joined them, carrying official papers documenting the women's innocence and the convictions of their accusers. "Henderson and his partners will spend the next 15 years in territorial prison," he announced. Their cattle rustling operation extended across 3 counties, and they would have continued using innocent people as scapegoats if not for Mr. Morrison's intervention. Martha Wilson arrived with a basket of food for the women's journey home, along with letters from several townspeople expressing their apologies and hopes for better relations in the future. The schoolteacher had become a leader in the effort to rebuild trust between the communities. "I've been thinking about what happened here," Martha said to the group. "How quickly fear can make people forget their principles and their humanity. We need to do better as a community." Deputy Collins, now wearing a temporary sheriff's badge, nodded in agreement. "I've already reached out to the Apache Tribal Council about establishing better communication. Maybe we can prevent misunderstandings like this in the future." As the women prepared to leave Copper Creek and return to their people, Jake felt a sense of completion, but also concern about what lay ahead. Henderson's journal had revealed that their criminal network extended far beyond this one town, and there were likely other innocent people who had been blamed for crimes they didn't commit. Ayanna paused before mounting her horse and looked directly at Jake. "The desert is vast and full of dangers, but it also connects all people who travel it with honesty and respect. You will always be welcome at our fires, Jake Morrison, and you'll always have friends in Copper Creek," Martha Wilson added. "This town has learned a valuable lesson about the importance of seeking truth before seeking revenge." Judge Crawford had decided to remain in the area for several more weeks to investigate other cases that might have been tainted by similar prejudices and rushed judgments. His presence would help ensure that the changes in Copper Creek would have time to take root and become permanent. As Jake watched the 3 Apache women ride away toward the desert horizon, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few short days. A town that had been ready to commit murder based on lies and prejudice was now beginning to examine its own conscience and seek a better path forward. The investigation had revealed even more disturbing details about the scope of Henderson's criminal enterprise. His partners had confessed to similar schemes in at least 4 other towns across the territory, always targeting Native American communities because they knew local prejudices would make conviction easy and investigation unlikely. Dozens of innocent people had probably died or suffered imprisonment because of these carefully orchestrated frame-ups. Jake had received offers to stay in Copper Creek permanently, either as the new sheriff or as a deputy working under Collins. The town council had even offered him a substantial reward for his services, along with free land and a guaranteed position in the community. But Jake knew that his calling was elsewhere, riding the desert trails and carrying messages between isolated settlements where his unique skills might again be needed. Dr. Hayes had documented everything that had happened in Copper Creek, planning to submit a detailed report to territorial authorities about the dangers of prejudice-based justice and the need for proper legal procedures in frontier communities. His work would eventually lead to reforms in how suspected crimes were investigated and prosecuted. Throughout the Western Territories, Martha Wilson had started a correspondence with Ayanna and other educated members of the Apache community, hoping to build bridges of understanding that could prevent future conflicts. She had also begun teaching her students about the importance of seeking truth rather than accepting easy answers based on fear or prejudice. As Jake prepared to leave Copper Creek and continue his journey across the vast desert landscape, he carried with him more than just mail and supplies. He carried the knowledge that individual courage and determination could still make a difference in a world that often seemed dominated by hatred and injustice. The morning sun was climbing higher as Jake mounted his horse for the last time in Copper Creek. His next destination was a mining camp 3 days' ride to the east, where silver discoveries had attracted both honest prospectors and dangerous criminals. The Territorial Mail Service had received reports of suspicious activities there, and Jake suspected that his unique combination of investigative skills and frontier experience might once again be needed. Sheriff Collins approached as Jake was making his final preparations to leave. The young man had grown considerably in confidence and wisdom over the past few days, and Jake believed he would serve the community well in his new role. "Jake," Collins said, extending his hand for a firm handshake, "I want you to know that what you did here changed more than just the fate of those 3 women. You changed how this whole town thinks about justice and truth." "You played your part too," Jake replied. "It took courage for you to question your superior and help me gather evidence. Don't forget that when future difficult decisions come your way." Judge Crawford appeared from the hotel, carrying his traveling bag and official papers. He would be departing for the territorial capital later that day to file his report and recommend reforms to prevent similar incidents in other communities. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said formally, "I want you to know that your actions here will be noted in my official report to the territorial governor. Your courage and dedication to justice exemplify the best qualities of frontier life." Jake tipped his hat respectfully. "Justice isn't something that happens automatically, Judge. It takes people willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous." As Jake rode out of Copper Creek for the last time, he looked back to see the townspeople going about their daily business with what appeared to be a new sense of purpose and responsibility. The hanging tree still stood in the town square, but Jake believed it would remain unused as long as people remembered the lessons learned from this near tragedy. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, full of challenges and opportunities for a man willing to face them with courage and integrity. Jake Morrison, the lone desert rider, continued his journey knowing that somewhere in that vast landscape, other innocent people might need his help, and other communities might benefit from his unique brand of frontier justice based on truth rather than prejudice. Behind him, Copper Creek settled into a new era of law and order, forever changed by the events that had brought truth to light and prevented a terrible injustice. The 3 Apache women rode safely toward their home, carrying with them proof that courage and compassion could still triumph over hatred and greed, even in the harsh and unforgiving frontier wilderness.